A millionaire hires a tutor with a special background for his disabled niece. A few months after he returns from a business trip, the house suddenly makes strange sounds. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the scent of wet earth lingered in the air. A soft mist curled around the iron gates, clinging to the towering stone pillars that flanked the entrance. Beyond them, the driveway stretched long and winding, disappearing into a dense embrace of oaks and maples. It wasn't the kind of road one walked. It was meant to be driven on, sleek tires rolling over smooth gravel, carrying important people to important places. Carolyn tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase, glancing at the heavy gates before her. They were magnificent in their craftsmanship, intricate ironwork twisting into elegant swirls, but they stood closed, silent and imposing. She hesitated only for a second before pressing the intercom button. A sharp buzz followed, then a voice, crisp and firm. "Name?" Carolyn took a breath. "Carolyn Bell. I was hired as Miss Anna Sherman's tutor." A pause. Then the gates clicked open, groaning slightly as they parted. The estate emerged as she stepped inside, an expanse of manicured perfection, where every hedge, every flowerbed, every path had been carved into existence with deliberate care. The mansion itself stood at the end of the driveway, its facade a blend of old-world elegance and modern austerity. Large windows, perfectly polished, reflected the overcast sky. Tall columns lined the entrance, lending it the appearance of a place meant to be admired from a distance, not lived in. By the time she reached the front steps, the door had already opened. Margaret stood at the threshold. She was not a frail woman, though age had lined her face with careful etchings of time. Her posture was upright, her hands clasped neatly before her, her expression unreadable. Everything about her, her meticulous uniform, the sharp assessment in her eyes, the slight arch of her brow, spoke of someone who had spent decades running a house where every detail mattered. "Miss Bell." The greeting was polite, but devoid of warmth. Carolyn nodded. "Mrs. Margaret, I assume." A flicker of approval. "Just Margaret will do. Follow me." The entrance hall was grand, but it was the silence that struck Carolyn the most. There was no trace of footsteps, no distant hum of conversation, no quiet music playing from unseen speakers. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, as if the house had been holding its breath for too long. Margaret led her through a series of corridors, her voice even as she spoke. "Mr. Sherman is away on business. He won't return for another 2 months. Your employment has been arranged in his absence." "I understand," Carolyn replied, glancing at the tall windows they passed. The outside world looked blurred through the glass, softened by the lingering mist. "You'll be responsible for Miss Anna's education," Margaret continued, "as well as ensuring she engages in activities beneficial to her well-being. She requires patience." Carolyn caught the slight pause. "She doesn't respond well to new people." Margaret's steps didn't slow, but the shift in her expression was telling. "Miss Anna prefers solitude." They stopped in front of a door. Margaret knocked lightly before pushing it open. Inside, by the window, sat a girl no older than 10, her posture perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was dressed in soft grey and pale blue, her dark hair brushed smooth, falling just past her shoulders. But it was her eyes that held Carolyn's attention. Large, guarded, impossibly quiet. "This is Miss Anna," Margaret introduced, though the girl made no move to acknowledge either of them. Carolyn took a step forward. "Hello, Anna. It's nice to meet you." There was no reply. Instead, Anna turned her head slightly, her gaze shifting just enough to regard Carolyn with cool disinterest, as if measuring the worth of this new presence in her home. Carolyn didn't press. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let Anna sit in it without the burden of expectation. The room itself mirrored the girl, pristine but untouched, as if everything inside it had been arranged for a life that was no longer being lived. The bookshelf was lined with volumes too neat to have been well loved. The small writing desk bore no stray pencils, no lingering scraps of unfinished thoughts. Even the air in the room felt still, like the house itself had learned to tread lightly here. Margaret cleared her throat. "Shall I bring tea?" Anna's gaze flickered toward the older woman. It wasn't quite an answer, but Margaret seemed to understand it regardless. Carolyn, watching, finally spoke again. "I heard there's a piano in the house." A small shift, so subtle it could have been imagined. Carolyn didn't push, didn't ask if Anna played. She simply let the words settle, then turned slightly toward Margaret. "I'd love some tea as well, if it's not too much trouble." Margaret hesitated for only a fraction of a second, before nodding and disappearing down the hall. For the first time since stepping into the room, Carolyn sat down, not across from Anna, but beside the window, giving her space. The two of them sat in the silence, the heavy air between them shifting, if only just a little. Carolyn let out a quiet breath, her eyes settling on the world beyond the glass. This house, this child, this strange waiting space. She wasn't sure how much she could change here, how much she was allowed to, but she would stay, and she would try. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Outside, the garden stretched toward the horizon, an expanse of trimmed hedges and quiet paths, winding beneath oak trees that stood like silent guardians. A slight breeze disturbed the leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth after last night's rain. Carolyn sat in the study, fingers trailing absently over the leather binding of a book she hadn't yet opened. The silence in the house was heavy, not oppressive, but deliberate, as though each room held its breath, waiting for something to change. Margaret entered, her steps measured, her hands lightly folded in front of her apron. She carried with her an air of quiet authority, the kind forged from years of maintaining order in a house that had once been filled with more life than it was now. She paused by the sideboard, adjusting a porcelain vase that needed no adjusting, then turned her gaze toward Carolyn. "You should know, Miss Anna wasn't always this way," Margaret said, her voice calm, but weighted with something unspoken. Carolyn looked up, setting the book aside. "How long has she been here?" Margaret hesitated, as if measuring how much to say. Then, with a sigh, she lowered herself into the chair across from Carolyn. "It's been a year since she came to live here. Her parents—" She paused, her hands smoothing over the fabric of her skirt. "It was a car accident, a winter storm. The roads were bad." Carolyn's grip on the book tightened. She didn't speak, just let Margaret continue. "She was in the car with them." Margaret's voice softened, and for the first time, her usual composed demeanor cracked slightly. "They didn't make it, but she did." Carolyn exhaled slowly, glancing toward the study door. The weight of those words settled over her, wrapping around the image of the quiet girl she had met the day before. "She survived," Margaret continued, "but she hasn't been the same since. She barely speaks, barely eats unless told to, and she hasn't stepped foot outside in months." Carolyn frowned slightly. "She doesn't go outside at all?" Margaret shook her head. "She used to. She loved it, spent hours in the garden, climbing the trees, reading in the sun. But after the accident, something changed. She refuses to go near the doors. It's like—" She hesitated before continuing. "It's like she's afraid to move forward, as if leaving this house might make everything feel final." Carolyn nodded slowly, the pieces settling in her mind. "And Nathan?" "He does what he can," Margaret said carefully. "He's never been the expressive type, but he cares for her, deeply. He just doesn't always know how to show it." There was a pause, the kind that filled rooms where sorrow had lived too long. Finally, Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt again, as if grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of routine. "I thought you should know," she said, voice steady once more. "So you understand what you're walking into." Carolyn watched as the older woman disappeared down the hall, leaving only the faint scent of lavender in her wake. The next morning, Carolyn found Anna in the study, seated in her usual spot by the window. The girl was poised, composed, but her fingers were curled too tightly in her lap, her posture almost too perfect. A child holding herself together with invisible threads. Carolyn set her books down on the table and took the chair across from her. "I thought we could start with literature today," she said, keeping her tone light. "Or, if you'd prefer, we can do something else." Anna's gaze barely flickered. "Literature is fine." It wasn't an answer. It was a dismissal wrapped in politeness. Carolyn opened the book, reading the first line aloud, but Anna's eyes remained unfocused, distant. Every question Carolyn posed was met with clipped, empty responses, as though the girl had perfected the art of appearing present without truly being there. After half an hour, Carolyn closed the book gently. "I think that's enough for today." Anna said nothing, only nodding once before turning her attention back to the window. Carolyn watched her for a moment, then stood and left the room without another word. That night, as Carolyn sat in her room, she found herself staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of the house. She had known silence before, the kind that lingered in orphanage hallways after the lights went out, the kind that stretched between words left unsaid, the kind that wrapped around a child who had learned too early that hoping for kindness often led to disappointment. She had spent years learning how to be invisible, how to fit into spaces without demanding too much, and she saw the same thing in Anna, the quiet way she held herself, the way she seemed to expect that people would either push too hard or leave too soon. Carolyn turned onto her side, exhaling. She wouldn't push, and she wouldn't leave. She would wait, just like someone, once, had waited for her. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm, a quiet yet persistent presence beyond the walls of the Sherman estate. Rain drummed against the tall windows, a muffled echo in the vast house. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the darkened corridors, flickering against the crystal chandeliers before disappearing into silence once more. Inside the study, the air was heavy with quiet. Carolyn sat at the grand piano, her fingers lightly resting on the keys, though she had yet to press them. Across the room, Anna was in her usual place, seated by the window, her wheelchair positioned just so, as if she had been placed there rather than choosing it herself. Her hands rested limply on the armrests, her posture stiff but not uncomfortable. Carolyn had learned to recognize this silence, not as a passive absence of sound, but as something much heavier. A silence that was chosen, held on to, perhaps even protected. She had spent the last hour attempting small conversations, gentle nudges in the form of questions that barely received a response. Anna had given her nothing more than a few nods, a single word here and there, before retreating into stillness once again. Carolyn didn't push. She exhaled, letting her fingers move absently over the piano keys, brushing them just enough to create a whisper of sound. It wasn't music yet, just fragmented notes, soft and unformed. She hadn't played in years, not properly, not since she was a child, sitting in a different kind of house, one that had been filled with voices, yet never warmth. Then, without thinking, she played. The melody was unplanned, something familiar yet distant, woven from memory rather than intention. It was slow and delicate, filling the space between them, slipping into the corners of the study where silence had lived for too long. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement. Anna's fingers curled slightly on the armrests of her wheelchair, and though she didn't turn fully, her head tilted just enough for Carolyn to notice. A small shift, a subtle acknowledgement. Carolyn continued playing, careful not to startle whatever fragile thread had formed between them. She let each note fall softly, unrushed, inviting, but never demanding. The air in the room felt different, not lighter, but changed. Then, so quietly, it was almost lost beneath the rain. "Can you teach me?" The words were hesitant, uncertain. Not a request, not yet, just a thought spoken aloud, as if Anna herself wasn't sure what she was asking. Carolyn paused, lifting her hands gently from the keys. She didn't turn immediately, didn't react with the kind of enthusiasm that might have made Anna retreat. Instead, she let the silence return, this time softer, this time holding something different. "Of course," Carolyn said, her voice quiet but sure. Anna said nothing more, her gaze drifting back toward the window, as if the words had never left her lips. But her shoulders were not as tense as they had been before, and she had asked. That was enough. That evening, the storm eased into a gentle drizzle, the sky turning a deep shade of grey-blue as the last light faded beyond the horizon. Carolyn sat in her room, a book open on her lap, though she had barely turned a page in the last hour. She found herself staring at the flickering lamp beside her, the warm glow pooling onto the wooden nightstand, her thoughts circling back to the moment in the study. Anna had turned. Not much, not fully, but just enough. Carolyn had spent weeks trying to reach her, speaking carefully, waiting patiently, hoping for a response that never came. And in the end, it hadn't been words that had done it. It had been music. She thought about the way Anna had gripped her wheelchair just slightly, the way her eyes had shifted toward the piano, not looking at Carolyn, not engaging, but listening. It was a small thing, but small things mattered in a house like this, where grief was woven into the fabric of every hallway, where silence had settled into the very walls. Carolyn closed the book without marking her page. For the first time, something had cracked open the stillness of the house, and it had not been unwelcome. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth, a lingering trace of the previous night's storm. The estate, usually untouched by weather, bore subtle evidence of it. Drops of rain still clung to the glass of the tall windows, the stone pathways outside darker, the hedges weighed down by lingering moisture. Inside, the house had returned to its usual hush. But something had shifted. Carolyn sat at the piano, waiting. Anna's wheelchair approached at an unhurried pace, her hands moving carefully over the wheels. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the instrument, not on Carolyn. "I'm not sure I can do it," Anna said, her voice quieter than usual, as if saying it aloud would make it truer. Carolyn turned slightly, resting an elbow on the piano bench. "You don't have to be sure yet." Anna hesitated, fingers tightening against the armrests. Then, without another word, she wheeled herself closer. Carolyn didn't guide her immediately. Instead, she let Anna sit with the moment, let her take in the polished keys, the way the light from the window reflected off the instrument's surface. When Carolyn finally lifted Anna's hands, it was with the lightest touch, her fingers resting just beneath Anna's own, supporting, but not forcing. "Try pressing this one," Carolyn said, tapping a key. Anna hesitated before pressing down. The note rang out, clear and whole. Carolyn smiled. "See? Nothing impossible about it." Anna exhaled, as if she had been holding something in. "It's different than I thought it would be." "How so?" "It feels more real," she admitted. "Listening to it and playing it aren't the same." Carolyn nodded. "Most things aren't." They spent the next half hour on simple exercises, Carolyn keeping her voice even, her instructions light. There was no urgency, no pressure to be perfect, just movement, sound, and patience. Anna didn't speak much, but she stayed, she tried, and that was more than enough. That evening, the soft chime of the clock in the hallway marked the passing of time. The house remained quiet, but the usual stillness felt different. Margaret noticed it first. She stood at the entrance to the dining room, watching as Carolyn carefully poured tea into a delicate porcelain cup. Across from her, Anna was reading a sheet of music, brows drawn in concentration, her fingers tracing invisible notes across the table's surface. "She hasn't looked this focused in months," Margaret murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Carolyn glanced up, catching the rare softness in the older woman's gaze. Margaret didn't often comment on Anna's progress. She was careful with her words, cautious not to get anyone's hopes up. But there was something unguarded in her expression tonight. Carolyn simply nodded. "She asked me to teach her." Margaret inhaled, as if allowing herself to believe it. "Good," she said after a pause. "That's good." And for once, she didn't leave immediately. She lingered, watching the quiet moment unfold before disappearing down the hall. Later that night, as Margaret reached for the hallway lamp to signal bedtime, she heard Anna's voice from inside the study, just a little longer. Margaret turned back, raising a brow. Anna was at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, shoulders squared in quiet defiance. Carolyn sat beside her, equally still. "You need rest," Margaret said, though the words didn't carry their usual weight. Anna exhaled, frustration flickering in her eyes. "I will. I just—" Her hands curled into fists on her lap before she muttered, "I'm not finished yet." Margaret studied her for a moment. She had spent the last year trying to coax Anna into caring about something, anything. Now here she was, asking to stay awake, asking for more time, asking to keep going. A rare thing. Margaret let out a slow breath and shook her head. 15 more minutes. Anna gave a firm nod before returning her focus to the keys. Carolyn didn't speak, but she met Margaret's gaze with quiet understanding. Margaret turned, stepping into the hallway. For the first time in a long while, she didn't mind breaking the rules. And from inside the study, faint but steady, the sound of music carried through the house. The estate was quiet when Nathan returned, but not the kind of silence he was used to. There was warmth here now, a shift in the air, subtle yet undeniable. The house, which had felt like a mausoleum for so long, seemed lighter. The corridors no longer carried the weight of empty rooms and unspoken grief. Even the shadows cast by the dim hallway lamps seemed softer. His footsteps echoed lightly as he moved toward the library, where the faintest glow seeped out from beneath the door. He hadn't expected anyone to still be awake. Pushing open the door, he stopped. A woman sat curled up in the leather armchair by the fireplace, a book resting on her lap, her fingers gently pinching the edge of a page, as though caught mid-turn. She didn't startle at his entrance. Instead, she lifted her gaze, calm and unhurried. Nathan took her in, the quiet poise, the steady expression. Not what he had expected. "You must be Mr. Sherman," she said, voice even, unreadable. Nathan studied her for a moment. "And you must be Miss Bell." She inclined her head slightly, but there was no nervousness, no air of someone who had stepped into a life too large for them. He had reviewed her file before hiring her, an orphan, raised in a system that rarely offered stability. But there was nothing of that in her demeanor. "How was your trip?" she asked, as if they were merely exchanging pleasantries. "Long," Nathan admitted, "but productive." A small nod. She closed the book, setting it aside. "Would you like me to wake Margaret?" "Not necessary," he said. His eyes flickered toward the book she had been reading, a classic, well-worn but carefully handled. "You prefer to read late?" "Sometimes," she replied. "The house is quiet at night." Nathan allowed himself the briefest of smiles. "That it is." For a beat, neither spoke. Then Carolyn stood, offering a polite, unassuming nod before excusing herself. Nathan watched her leave. Composed, unfazed. Interesting. The morning greeted him with the distant murmur of voices. Nathan hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd woken up to the sound of life in the house. Following the voices, he stopped just outside the study, where the doors had been left slightly ajar. He could see Anna at the piano, her hands poised over the keys, Carolyn beside her, guiding her without forcing. "That's it," Carolyn said softly. "Let your fingers find the rhythm. Don't force them." Anna frowned slightly, her concentration deep, but there was no frustration, no retreating into silence. Instead, she nodded, pressing down again, a hesitant, imperfect melody filling the space between them. Nathan barely recognized his niece in that moment. There was color in her cheeks, something alive in her expression. She wasn't just existing, she was engaged, present. "Again," Anna murmured, and Carolyn simply nodded, as though she had expected nothing less. Nathan exhaled quietly, stepping back before either of them could notice him. At breakfast, he finally addressed Carolyn. "I saw you teaching Anna this morning." Carolyn glanced up from her tea. She asked. Nathan raised a brow. "She doesn't usually ask for much." Carolyn didn't reply immediately. Instead, she stirred her tea once, twice, before setting the spoon down neatly beside the cup. "Children don't always ask for what they need, Mr. Sherman. Sometimes they just wait to see if anyone notices." Nathan stilled. She wasn't wrong. For a long time, he had assumed that giving Anna space was what she needed, that his presence, his quiet acts of care, were enough. But had they been? Or had he simply been afraid of pushing too hard? Carolyn didn't press the moment, didn't linger on the weight of his silence. Instead, she took another sip of tea. Nathan watched her. This woman who had stepped into his home, and in just a matter of weeks, had shifted the very foundation of it. "You've done well," he said finally, keeping his voice measured. "With her." Carolyn gave a small nod, accepting the words without pretense. "I'm just here to help," she said simply. Nathan studied her a moment longer. He had read about her past, but he wasn't sure he had read enough. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite name yet, but he intended to find out. And the first change was small, almost imperceptible. A request. "Can I have some blank sheets of music?" Anna had asked one morning, her voice hesitant but clear. Carolyn looked up from where she had been sorting through a selection of literature books in the study. "Of course," she said, as though the request was the most natural thing in the world. Anna nodded, but there was something else in her expression, a quiet expectation, as if she was bracing for someone to deny her. But Carolyn didn't. And the next day, another request followed. "I'd like a set of paints, the ones that come in tubes, not the dry palettes." Then, a week later, another. "I want to go outside." The last one had caught Carolyn off guard. Anna had positioned her wheelchair by the window, staring out at the garden. The grass was still damp from the morning dew, and the trees cast long, dappled shadows across the stone pathways. Carolyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, positioning herself at eye level. "Would you like me to go with you?" Anna's fingers curled slightly on the armrest. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. Nathan noticed it all. He noticed the way Anna had started asking for things again, small as they were. He noticed how she spoke to Carolyn in ways she hadn't spoken to anyone else in over a year. And more than anything, he noticed Carolyn herself. She never imposed, never forced. She moved through the house as though she belonged there, yet carried herself in a way that made it clear she never assumed she did. He saw it in the way she listened, how she never interrupted, never rushed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. It was in the way she moved, her steps light, her presence steady, but never overwhelming. One evening, he found himself watching her from across the parlor, studying the way she readjusted the lamp near Anna's desk without a second thought, ensuring that the light was just right for the girl to read. It was such a small thing. But small things mattered. The night was cool, the sky dark velvet embroidered with stars. The scent of late-blooming jasmine lingered in the air, a quiet reminder that summer had not fully surrendered to autumn yet. Carolyn had come to the garden for air. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking along the stone paths before she realized she was no longer alone. Nathan stood near the edge of the terrace, hands in his pockets, gaze lifted toward the night sky. He hadn't noticed her approach at first, or perhaps he had and simply chose not to acknowledge it yet. "I didn't expect to find anyone else out here," Carolyn said eventually, breaking the quiet. Nathan glanced over, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I could say the same." She let the silence settle before speaking again. "It's beautiful at night." "It is," Nathan agreed, though his tone suggested he had never really stopped to notice before. Another pause. Then, "She's changed," he murmured. Carolyn didn't ask who he meant. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. She was always capable of it. Nathan turned to her then, something flickering in his gaze, a quiet understanding, an unspoken question. "You really believe that?" Carolyn met his gaze, steady and sure. "Yes." Nathan held her stare for a moment longer before exhaling, shaking his head slightly as if amused by her certainty. "You speak like you know her better than the rest of us." Carolyn didn't flinch. "Perhaps I do." Nathan didn't argue. Instead, he looked back toward the house, where the faintest glow of candlelight flickered through the study window. "She asked me to order more music sheets for her," he said after a while. Carolyn smiled faintly. "I know." Nathan glanced at her. "She tells you things. She tells me what she's ready for." Silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something quieter, something steady. Finally, Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair before pushing off the terrace railing. "I should head in." Carolyn nodded but remained where she was, her gaze still fixed on the sky. As Nathan passed, he paused just briefly beside her. "Good night, Miss Bell." "Good night, Mr. Sherman." She didn't turn as he left, nor did he look back. But in the darkness of the garden, with the stars above and the house behind them, something unspoken lingered, something that neither of them dared name just yet. The Sherman estate had not seen an event of this scale in years. A grand chandelier bathed the ballroom in golden light, flickering against polished marble floors and the soft sheen of evening gowns. Servers glided through the room, carrying crystal flutes filled with champagne, the murmur of conversation blending with the gentle hum of a string quartet. Nathan had spared no expense. He rarely entertained on this level, but tonight was different. The guest list was filled with business magnates, investors, and society figures. People he needed to maintain relationships with, people who expected a level of formality he had long grown tired of. Carolyn had not expected to be invited. She had assumed that her role as Anna's tutor kept her separate from these affairs. But when Margaret delivered a dress to her room earlier that afternoon, she understood. This was not a request, but an expectation. So she stood now, poised and composed, in an elegant but understated gown of deep blue. The fabric was soft against her skin, the neckline modest, the cut refined, a choice made, perhaps intentionally, so she would blend rather than stand out. It didn't work. People noticed her. Nathan noticed her. He had expected her to be out of place, awkward even. But she moved through the room with quiet confidence, speaking only when spoken to, offering polite smiles, her presence neither intrusive nor insignificant. More than once, he caught himself watching her, and he was not the only one. Carolyn had been reaching for a glass of water when a voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through the air behind her. "Well, well, what an unexpected reunion. If I'm not mistaken, Miss Carolyn Bell." Her fingers stilled before she turned. Victoria Jones stood before her, dressed in a deep emerald gown, her lips curved in a smile that did not reach her eyes. Beside her were Rachel and Wayne, their gazes sharp with familiar disdain. A moment stretched between them, heavy with recognition. Then Rachel's lips curled. "So, this is where you ended up." Carolyn did not flinch. Victoria took a slow sip of her champagne, eyes scanning Carolyn from head to toe with practiced ease. "I must say I'm impressed," she said, voice light, feigned amusement laced within. "I never imagined you would crawl your way into a place like this." Carolyn held her gaze, willing her hands to remain steady. Wayne scoffed. "What exactly are you doing here, Carolyn?" Before she could respond, Victoria let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, it's obvious, isn't it?" She must have found a very charitable employer. A hush settled around them. Guests nearby had begun to notice. Carolyn's breath was even, but she could feel the old weight pressing against her ribs, the same feeling she had known as a child in their house, the same suffocating expectation that she would always be less, always be an afterthought, an inconvenience. Victoria leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to feel intimate, yet sharp enough for those nearby to hear. "You don't belong here, dear." Before Carolyn could speak, another voice, cool, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative, broke the tension. "I don't tolerate disrespect in my home." Nathan. His presence was immediate, his voice smooth but sharp, a blade sheathed in velvet. The air in the room shifted as he stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his eyes dark with something unmistakably protective. Victoria turned, a delicate brow arching in practiced charm. "Mr. Sherman," she greeted smoothly, tilting her glass toward him. "We were just leaving," Nathan cut in, his tone polite but firm. Victoria's lips parted slightly in feigned surprise. "Oh? But we've only just—" "I'm not in the habit of entertaining guests who treat my employees with anything less than respect." The word employees was deliberate, a reminder that Carolyn was not just someone who happened to be here. She was a valued part of this household. A murmur rippled through the guests, curiosity flickering across faces. Victoria's expression flickered ever so slightly before she let out a soft chuckle, tilting her head. "My, how fascinating. I had no idea you were so sentimental." Nathan's jaw tensed, but before he could respond, another voice, small but sharp with conviction, cut through the air. "Anna." The girl's wheelchair had rolled into view, her small hands gripping the wheels as she pushed forward. "I don't understand," Anna said, her gaze locked onto Victoria with something far stronger than the hesitation she used to carry. "Why would my uncle invite people with no class to our house?" Silence. Pure, unshaken silence. Victoria's smile froze. Rachel's jaw tightened. Wayne shifted uncomfortably. Carolyn felt something in her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something startlingly close to pride. Nathan exhaled slowly, eyes flickering toward his niece before returning to Victoria. "I believe that answers any further questions." Victoria's expression remained poised, but Carolyn saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes before she let out a soft laugh, stepping back. "Well," she said, finishing the last of her champagne, "this has been enlightening." With that, she turned, her children following close behind, disappearing into the crowd. Nathan let out a quiet breath before looking down at Anna. "You didn't have to do that," he said gently. Anna lifted her chin slightly, her hands relaxed on the armrests of her chair. "Yes, I did." Nathan studied her for a long moment before offering a small nod. Then he turned to Carolyn. She met his gaze, expecting something, a question, a conversation, maybe even a demand for an explanation. Instead, he simply said, "Are you all right?" Not, "Who was she to you?" Not, "What did they mean?" Not, "Tell me everything." Just, "Are you all right?" Carolyn inhaled, steadying herself. "Yes," she murmured. Nathan gave a slight nod. "Good." And then, as if sensing that was all she could give at the moment, he turned and guided Anna back toward the party. Carolyn exhaled, pressing her hands together to still the slight tremor. Victoria had wanted her to crumble, but she hadn't, and somehow that mattered more than she could have imagined. The echoes of laughter and clinking glasses had faded, leaving only the hushed remnants of the grand party. The once lively halls of the Sherman estate now carried only the faint hum of the wind outside, the heavy velvet curtains barely stirring in the still air. Carolyn sat alone in the dimly lit parlor, the fire before her casting restless shadows along the walls. Her hands were folded in her lap, but she could feel the faint tremor lingering in her fingers, a ghost of the confrontation that had unraveled mere hours ago. She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there when she heard footsteps, Nathan's. He was quiet in his approach, but she didn't turn. She didn't need to. She could sense his presence, the way he hesitated just briefly before stepping forward. "You should be resting," he said finally, his voice low, careful. Carolyn let out a quiet breath, her gaze remaining fixed on the fire. "I could say the same to you." Nathan didn't argue. Instead, he took a seat across from her, leaning back slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. The flickering light illuminated the sharp angles of his face, the slight tension in his jaw, a tension that hadn't been there before tonight. After a long pause, he spoke again. Who was she? Carolyn swallowed. She had known this moment would come. She had known it from the second she locked eyes with Victoria across that ballroom. She was family, Carolyn admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Nathan's brow lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He just listened. Carolyn exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing against her ribs. When I was 9, my parents died. Car accident. It was quick. I barely remember the details anymore. She let out a hollow laugh. I suppose I was lucky. My uncle Albert Jones took me in. His wife, Victoria, wasn't as eager. Nathan's expression didn't change, but there was something sharper in his silence now. At first, she tolerated me, Carolyn continued, her voice steady but distant. But 3 years later, after Albert passed, I became an inconvenience, a burden. She made that very clear. She stared into the fire, the flames twisting and curling as memories surfaced. The cold hallways of the Jones estate, the whispers that followed her, the way Rachel and Wayne had watched with smug amusement as their mother slowly stripped away any sense of belonging she had left. She didn't just ignore me, Carolyn said softly. She made sure I understood exactly what I was to her. Unwanted. Disposable. Nathan's jaw tensed. Carolyn didn't look at him. She didn't want to see the pity in his eyes. One day, she told me we were going on a trip, Carolyn said, her voice barely above a whisper now. She drove me to an orphanage, walked me inside, signed the papers. Nathan's grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. She left without looking back. Carolyn finally turned her head, meeting Nathan's gaze. That was the last time I saw her, until tonight. The fire crackled between them, filling the space where words had momentarily failed. Nathan's silence wasn't empty. It was weighted, filled with something she couldn't quite name. She wanted me to break, Carolyn admitted. She wanted me to feel small again, to remind me that I was nothing. Nathan's voice was quiet but firm. She failed. Carolyn inhaled sharply. Nathan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was steady, unwavering. You stood your ground. You didn't let her see you flinch. Carolyn's throat tightened. I never expected anyone to defend me, she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Nathan's expression softened, not with pity, but with something far steadier, something certain. You deserve to be defended." The words settled between them, quiet but resolute. Carolyn turned her gaze back to the fire, letting them sink in. She wasn't sure she believed them yet, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to. The following days passed in a strange quiet. Not the kind that used to haunt the house, thick with grief and absence, but something gentler, more uncertain. Carolyn felt it in the way Margaret watched her a little more carefully, as if searching for signs of distress. She felt it in the way Nathan spoke to her, his voice just a fraction softer, his questions a little more deliberate, as though he wanted to say something more but hadn't quite decided what. And most of all, she felt it in Anna, who now sought her presence with an ease that should have been comforting. And yet, there was a voice, deep in the quietest part of Carolyn's mind, whispering, "What if this isn't permanent?" She had learned long ago that belonging was a temporary thing, something given conditionally, something that could be revoked as quickly as it was offered. She had seen it in the way Victoria smiled at her once, years ago, and then sent her away without looking back. She had seen it in the shifting eyes of strangers at the orphanage, the way they never stayed long enough to really see her. So what made this place, this family, any different? It was Margaret who found her in the kitchen late one evening. Carolyn wasn't doing much, just standing at the counter, absent-mindedly wiping a stray crumb away, as if the simple act of tidying something might also settle the storm in her mind. Margaret didn't ask questions right away. Instead, she set down the cup of tea she had been carrying and reached for the flour tin, preparing the dough for tomorrow's bread. For a while they worked in silence. Then Margaret spoke, her voice easy but pointed. "You've been carrying something heavy these past few days." Carolyn hesitated, then exhaled, her fingers tracing patterns on the marble counter. "I suppose I have." Margaret glanced at her, patient. "Do you want to talk about it?" Carolyn swallowed. The words weren't easy. "I don't know how to stay," she admitted finally, her voice quiet, uncertain. "I don't know how to trust that this isn't just temporary." Margaret nodded, as though she had been expecting this. Then, without looking up from the dough she was kneading, she said, "Family isn't just blood, dear. It's who chooses to stay." Carolyn's fingers stilled against the countertop. Margaret pressed on, her voice as steady as ever. "I've seen people come and go from this house, but I've never seen Miss Anna take to someone the way she has with you." She dusted a bit of flour from her hands and met Carolyn's gaze. "And I've never seen Mr. Sherman look at anyone quite the way he looks at you." Carolyn's breath caught slightly, but Margaret simply gave her a knowing smile before returning to her work. A few days later, as Carolyn pushed open the study door, she found Anna sitting at the piano, her fingers lightly grazing the keys, but not pressing down. Carolyn didn't say anything right away. Instead, she took a seat beside her, waiting. Anna didn't look up, but after a moment, her voice broke the silence. "Are you going to leave?" Carolyn stilled. Anna's hands curled into her lap, gripping the folds of her dress. "People always leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They say they won't, but they do." Carolyn exhaled slowly. She thought about Margaret's words, thought about the people who had walked away from her, thought about Victoria, about the hollow feeling of being left behind. And then she thought about Anna, a girl who had already lost so much, who had only just begun to believe in something again. She reached out, her fingers light but certain, resting over Anna's small, clenched hands. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. Anna didn't respond right away, but after a moment, her shoulders relaxed, and she gave the faintest nod. Carolyn squeezed her hand once before letting go, and for the first time, the voice in the back of her mind, the one that had always whispered warnings, always told her she was only ever passing through, began to quiet. Nathan was a man who noticed things. He had built his success on careful observation, of markets, of people, of the unspoken currents beneath polished conversations. But what unsettled him now was that, despite all his awareness, he hadn't noticed Carolyn creeping into his life the way she had. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't something either of them had planned. But her presence had become familiar, woven into the fabric of the house in ways he had not anticipated. It was in the small things, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when thinking, her fingers pausing just briefly on the page of a book before she turned it. The way she moved through the house, not like someone trying to belong, but like someone who had once belonged somewhere and had long forgotten what it felt like. He had seen women try to fit into his world before, socialites who adjusted their laughter to suit the moment, who draped themselves in easy charm, who understood the art of calculated presence. Carolyn was none of those things. She was composed but not rehearsed, poised but not polished in the way people expected her to be. There was something unshaped about her, as though she had been raised in refinement but had been cast out of it too soon. He shouldn't care about any of this, but he did. It happened one evening, without intention. Nathan had been reviewing documents in the library, papers spread across the desk, numbers and negotiations pulling at his focus. Carolyn had come in to return a book, but somehow she had ended up beside him, glancing over the ledger he had left open. She hadn't spoken at first. Then, after a pause, she said lightly, "You're being overcharged on your shipment fees." Nathan glanced at her. "Am I?" She nodded, tapping a number on the page. "They've layered in a redundancy charge here. If you negotiate from the distributor level, you can cut it by 20%. Nathan studied the ledger, his brows lifting slightly. She wasn't wrong. He looked at her. "You're good at this." Carolyn gave a small shrug. Numbers make sense. People don't. Nathan wasn't sure why that answer sat in his chest longer than it should have. They fell into quiet after that, Carolyn skimming through another page, Nathan making notes. And then, their hands brushed. It was nothing, just a brief touch, skin against skin in the simplest, most unremarkable way. But the moment it happened, the air in the room shifted. Nathan didn't move, neither did she. For a fraction of a second, they were just still, frozen in that tiny, meaningless contact that suddenly didn't feel meaningless at all. Then Carolyn exhaled, a quiet breath, and withdrew her hand. The moment passed, but it did not disappear. Nathan had always assumed Carolyn's presence in the house was about Anna. She had come for Anna. She had stayed for Anna. But it was becoming harder to ignore the way he watched her, not just as Anna's tutor, but as someone whose presence in his life had begun to feel less like an arrangement and more like a necessity. One evening, he walked past the kitchen and paused at the sight inside. Carolyn was sitting at the table, laughing, really laughing, as Margaret scolded Anna for sneaking a cookie before dinner. Anna, with a guilty grin, was holding half a cookie behind her back, giggling. Carolyn's laughter was soft, unrestrained, her head tilting slightly as she shook her head in mock disapproval. It was a sound that belonged here, in this house, in a way he hadn't expected. It was warm, comfortable, like a family. And Nathan found himself gripping the edge of the doorway, something pressing into his chest with a force he hadn't expected. This wasn't what he had planned. He had brought Carolyn here for Anna's sake. But now, he couldn't ignore it. He wanted her here for himself. That night, he found himself lingering near the study after Anna had gone to bed. Carolyn was there, as she often was, seated in one of the armchairs with a book resting on her lap. She didn't look up immediately when he entered, instead finishing the last sentence of whatever she was reading before marking the page with her finger. "You don't usually stay up this late," she noted. Nathan leaned against the edge of the desk, folding his arms. "Neither do you." She glanced at him then, her expression unreadable, as if trying to determine whether there was more weight to his words than what was spoken. He wasn't sure what he had intended to say when he came in, maybe nothing, maybe everything. But as he watched her, the way the firelight played against her features, the way she sat so effortlessly in a space that should not have been hers, but somehow was, he felt something shift again, and this time he wasn't sure he wanted to stop it. Nathan was not a man prone to hesitation. His decisions had always been calculated, precise, and carried out without second-guessing. It was how he had built his life, his success, through careful planning and an unwavering certainty in his own choices. And yet, when it came to Carolyn, he had hesitated. Not because he didn't know what he wanted, but because, for the first time in his life, what he wanted was something he couldn't guarantee. Carolyn had become part of the Sherman estate in a way that felt effortless, inevitable. She wasn't just Anna's tutor. She was woven into the laughter at the dinner table, into the soft notes of the piano drifting through the hallways, into the quiet comfort of an evening spent reading by the fire. She had made this place feel like home again, and Nathan wasn't ready to let that go. It was a crisp autumn evening when he finally decided. Carolyn was in the study, curled up in her usual armchair, a book resting in her lap. The fire flickered softly, casting a warm glow against the dark, wood-paneled walls. Nathan stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. She didn't notice him at first. She was deep in thought, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the pages before she turned them. He had seen her like this before, lost in a world of words, unaware of anything else. But tonight, he needed her to see him. Stepping inside, he let the door close behind him. "You're restless," Carolyn observed without looking up. Nathan exhaled, moving toward the fireplace. "I have something to say, and I'd rather not waste time circling around it." That caught her attention. She closed the book slowly, resting it on her lap, her gaze now fixed on him. There was a quiet steadiness in her expression, a patience that unnerved him more than it should have. Nathan met her eyes. "Stay," he said. The word hung between them, simple yet heavy. Carolyn blinked once, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. "For Anna?" she asked at last, her voice careful. Nathan shook his head. "Not just for Anna." Something flickered in her gaze. Nathan took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, though he still didn't touch her. "Stay for me," he said, quieter this time. Carolyn inhaled sharply, and for the first time in a very long time, someone wasn't asking her to leave. The next morning at breakfast, Margaret immediately knew something had changed. Carolyn was setting the table, and Nathan, who had never bothered with such things before, was helping her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Margaret raised an eyebrow, then shook her head with a knowing sigh. "Finally," she muttered, before turning back toward the stove. Nathan shot her a look, but Carolyn, standing beside him with a teacup in hand, just laughed. And Nathan realized how much he liked that sound. A moment later, Anna wheeled into the room, her sharp gaze flickering between them. "What's so funny?" she asked suspiciously. Carolyn shook her head. "Nothing." Anna squinted at her, then turned to Nathan. "Are you going to marry her?" Nathan nearly choked on his coffee. Carolyn, meanwhile, almost dropped the plate she was holding. Margaret, to her credit, did not react at all. She simply kept stirring the eggs. "A very good question," she mused. Nathan set his cup down, clearing his throat. Anna clapped her hands together. "You should. I approve." Carolyn groaned. "We weren't asking for your approval, Anna." "But you have it anyway," Anna said smugly, wheeling herself to the table. "And if I were you, I'd take it while it's still being offered." Nathan bit back a laugh. Margaret chuckled softly, setting a plate down in front of Anna. Carolyn, however, was pointedly avoiding his gaze. Nathan let it go, for now. But later, as they passed each other in the hallway, he caught her wrist lightly, just enough to make her pause. "You haven't answered me yet," he murmured. Carolyn tilted her head. About what? Nathan didn't play along. You know what? Carolyn hesitated, but only for a second. Then, she smiled. I'm still here, aren't I? Nathan exhaled, then did something he had been resisting for far too long. He reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Yes, he murmured, you are. And that was enough. The estate, once a place of silence and coldness, was now filled with warmth, laughter, and love. Anna played the piano again. Margaret hummed while she worked. The dinners were livelier, the hallways less empty, the nights no longer filled with only the sound of the wind. And Carolyn no longer thought about leaving. She had spent so much of her life waiting for someone to send her away, but this time she had chosen to stay. And for the first time, someone had chosen her too. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.